Alrighty. Well, welcome to another 21st Century Disciples Bible Study. Thank you for showing up and watching, and I hope it will be uh, useful to you. I'm sure it will. I find it fascinating. As you can see, we are going through Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Zechariah, only parts of them, not the entire thing. Um, Obviously, Isaiah being 66 chapters long, I could talk about it for weeks. But we will be very scripture heavy this week, which I think is a good thing. And um, yeah, so we'll go from there. Now, when I say scripture heavy, I'm going to be reading in their entirety Isaiah 53 and Zechariah 11. Then there's some verses in Jeremiah that I'm going to read. Uh, well, one of which I'm going to read, not two of which, sorry. Um, and I'll be pointing out some other verses in both Isaiah and Jeremiah that are also prophetic in their well, there are prophecies of the Messiah. And then also Zechariah 12, verse 1 and verse 10. Not through verse 10, but 1 and 10. Before we do that, I do want to mention a few things about the books because it is very important since we are talking about messianic prophecies. Now, how do we know for a fact that these are prophecies and weren't written after the time of Christ? Well, for Isaiah, the earliest copy that we have is in the Dead Sea Scrolls found back in the 1940s, and it itself is dated between 150 and 100 BC. There is a slightly later dating. There were several carbon-14 tests that were done, but between the carbon-14 test and various writing style um, critiques, I guess you would call them, criticisms, they are able to fairly well say that this was probably um, this particular copy was probably made between 150 and 100 BC. Now it might be a little bit older. Maybe somebody was writing with an older, or well, if the writing style, yeah, because people could write with an older style, I suppose. But with the carbon-14 test backing it up, it does seem to be that age. I do remember seeing at least a copy of the Isaiah scroll in an exhibit in Kansas City back in, I want to say 2007 or 2008. I don't remember when exactly. Maybe even earlier, to be honest. That 5 years of college is kind of blurred together. But I remember looking at it, and there was one word over and over and over again, so several times, but one particular word. Um, it may not have been a copy of the big Isaiah scroll, but it was one of the copies of Isaiah found. And the word was Yahweh, Yod-He, Waw-He, the Tetragrammaton, the name of God. It was written in Paleo Hebrew script, where everything else was written in, um, I think you'd call it Babylonian Hebrew script, or it's really the modern Hebrew script, but by hand, not computer. So it's boxy. The Paleo Hebrew actually looks really interesting. I'm trying to learn, or I need to learn that alphabet, just for the heck of it. So now for both Jeremiah and Zechariah, I couldn't find any information on a specific oldest copy. Um, I'm not, I may not have dug deep enough, or I may not have been looking in the right places, but I did the same thing I did for Isaiah. So, um, however, we do know that Jeremiah and Zechariah were both found along with the Dead Sea Scrolls. As a matter of fact, every book of the Old Testament except for Esther was found with the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, someone might say that, well, Nehemiah wasn't found either, but that's because Nehemiah was considered part of Ezra back then, and they weren't split into um, the, let's see, the Greek Septuagint might have split them, or they might have been split later, but the group of Jews in the Dead Sea area would have considered it part of Ezra. So yes, it was found, just not specifically named. And the scrolls in the Dead Sea Scroll collection, as a collection, have been dated as being between 150 BC and 70 AD. 70 AD is when the Romans destroyed the Jewish temple, came into Jerusalem, and that's probably about when, or shortly thereafter, that they also came after the group in the Dead Sea area, known as the Essenes, by the way, and that's why they would be dated to 70 AD. Excuse me. So, you may say that, well, okay, so maybe Jeremiah and Zechariah were written a little bit after Christ. The only thing with that is that Jeremiah and Zechariah were also in the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures, what we call the Old Testament, and that was done around 200 BC. Now, there is something to be said about the Jeremiah copy in the Greek Septuagint, it's called. That's the Greek version of the Old Testament, and it has a shorter version compared to our version in our modern Bibles. At least in the Western churches, I believe the Orthodox Greek Church uses the shorter version. And I believe that both the shorter and longer versions were found in the Dead Sea Scroll collection. And it's not just that it's shorter, there's also certain sections that are in a different order in the Greek text in the shorter version than they are in the longer version. I don't know a whole lot about this, to be honest, except for what I've already told you, and that was with maybe a half hour or so of research. It is something that I want to look more into later when I have some more time. Right now I'm doing this Bible study and a few other things, but I am going to make a note of it, and I am going to look into it. And then I will do a presentation on it. My initial thoughts on it, though, are that it's not too terribly important. And by that I mean, I don't think that the quote-unquote missing sections from the shorter version are going to affect Messianic prophecy and Messianic doctrine that much in the rest of the Bible as a whole. And I don't think that the order is necessarily important, although I would have to look at Jeremiah and see if he uses any kind of dating to say, when he was writing, then it would be more important. But my initial reaction again is that with this one book, maybe needing to take some stuff out, as far as our modern Bibles, maybe we need to rethink the book of Jeremiah, make it shorter, take some stuff out, reorder some stuff. I don't think that's going to mess with Christian doctrine at all. And I don't think that, depending on the content of what we're taking out, actually no. With what we're taking out, it wouldn't affect the Bible's credibility any, right? If, to be honest, I don't know of anything in Jeremiah that is archaeologically proven to be false. I don't know of anything at all in the Bible that has been proven to be false. And that is a bold statement. I know there's questions about the conquering and the Exodus. We already talked about all that. But yeah, so I don't want to get too far off on a rabbit trail on that, so I'm going to get back onto our talk today. So, Messianic prophecies in Isaiah. This is where I'm going to read Isaiah 53 in its entirety. And I've got some other stuff here on the screen that will pop up. If I go too far beyond it, forgive me. But who has believed what we have heard? Who has the arm of Yahweh been revealed to? He grew up before him like a young plant, and like a root out of dry ground. He had no form or splendor, that we should look at him, no appearance, that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of suffering who knew what sickness was. He was like one people turned away from. He was despised, and we didn't value him. Yet he himself bore our sicknesses, and he carried our pains. But we in turn regarded him stricken, struck down by God, and afflicted. But he was pierced because of our transgressions, crushed because of our iniquities. Punishment for our peace was on him, and we are healed by his wounds. We all went astray like sheep. We all have turned to our own way, and Yahweh has punished him for the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. Like a lamb led to the slaughter, and like a sheep silent before her shearers, he did not open his mouth. He was taken away because of oppression and judgment, and who considered his fate? For he was cut from the land of the living. He was struck because of my people's rebellion. They made his grave with the wicked, and with a rich man at his death. Although he had done no violence, and had not spoken deceitfully. Yet Yahweh was pleased to crush him, and he made him sick. When you make him a restitution offering, he will see his seed, he will prolong his days, and the will of Yahweh will succeed by his hand. He will see it out of his anguish, and he will be satisfied with his knowledge. My righteous servant will justify many, and he will carry their iniquities. Therefore, I will give him the many as a portion, and he will receive the mighty as spoil, because he submitted himself to death, and was counted among the rebels. Yet he bore the sin of many, and interceded for the rebels. This is a powerful, powerful chapter, showing that whomever the Messiah was going to be, because at this point nobody knew, right? That he was going to be rejected by the people. Jesus was rejected by the people. Not everybody, but by enough. And it also talks about how the Messiah wasn't the physical champion, take us out of Egypt physically type Messiah that Israel was looking for at the time. Egypt, being Rome at that time, because Rome had taken over, obviously. And you can see this in the books of First and Second Maccabees, which are not canonical books, but are good historical, informative material. You can see that the Jews were looking for a Messiah who was going to rise up, take leadership, conquer whomever it was at that time within these few hundred years between that was ruling over them, and set up Israel as a kingdom again. And you can also see that in the various Messiah figures that had come before and after Jesus of Nazareth did. But here, we're seeing that God is going to afflict someone because of our transgressions, our pains, our sicknesses, everything. And of course, it talks in verse 6 there, we all like sheep have gone astray. That harkens to Paul's writing in Romans, where it says, everyone has fallen short of the glory of God. In verse 7, where it talks about him being silent like a lamb led to slaughter, obviously, if you read through the last part of the Gospels and you read through the trials that Jesus went through, he spoke a little bit, right? But what he didn't do, he never defended himself. And for being accused of what he was being accused of, any innocent person would have been talking a mile a minute trying to prove their innocence, right? Now, of course, the thing that they were accusing him of, blasphemy, he was innocent of blasphemy because he was who he said he was. They didn't know he was who he said he was, so in their eyes, he was guilty of blasphemy. You know, only his closest disciples, who most of whom had run away after he had gotten taken, they knew he was telling the truth. And I'm sure there were people that he healed that weren't necessarily disciples of his, but would have followed him. Uh, I'm sure they knew too. But the religious leaders and the bulk of the Jewish people, at first, yeah, he's a great teacher and he's healing people. He must be from God. But then he says he is God. And he does say that. We'll look at that when we talk about the Gospels here in a couple of weeks. And probably do 2 or 3 sessions on the Gospels. But otherwise, he was silent. There was even a point where Pontius Pilate asked him a question and he didn't say a word. And Pontius got angry at that and said, well, don't you know who I am? I can free you. And Jesus said, I don't need you to free me, basically. That's a paraphrase. So, being taken away because of oppression and judgment, and who considered his fate, they were oppressing him. They didn't like the influence that he was getting. If they could have won him over to their side, they would have liked it, obviously, but they knew they couldn't. Especially since publicly he denounced the Jewish religious leaders several times. Cut off from the living, always would be he dies. It doesn't say what kind of death, but we can see in other prophecies, one of which we'll talk about here in a minute, that it was by crucifixion. They make his grave with the wicked and with a rich man at his death. That harkens to being crucified alongside 2 thieves and then being laid into a rich man's tomb, because he was laid in Joseph of Arimathea's tomb, and he was a rather rich man. And of course, Jesus had not done anything wrong. Verse 10 is interesting. It says, yet Yahweh was pleased to crush him, and he made him sick. So you need to be careful when you read this, because obviously if you look at the rest of Scripture, God does not delight in crushing people. I know it may seem the opposite, because everyone, well, not everyone, but a lot of people do have an issue with the what happened to the Canaanites and the Egyptians. They don't take into account the evil wickedness of the Canaanites and the Egyptians. And God does not delight in striking anybody. And I believe that God doesn't desire anyone to go to hell. But he has to be just as well, and if they're not going to accept his rules, his justice, his mercy, then they're on their own. So when it says here that Yahweh was pleased to crush him, it's not that he enjoyed doing it, it's that how do I want to say this? It's that his plan which was his plan from before he even said, "Let there be light." His plan had come to fruition and worked. Of course, he knew it was always going to work. Um, and he is delighted that he is able to show mercy to those whom will accept it. If you don't accept it, you're not going to get it. So, um, and then the rest, he will be satisfied with his knowledge. His righteous servant will justify many. He will carry their iniquities. Um, he intercedes for the rebels. And from other passages, we know that he's not interceding for everybody, but only those who trust in him. There are some other chapters and verses here in Isaiah that give some other prophecies, which we'll point to a few of them in the Jeremiah passage, which isn't nearly as long. Um, and yeah, so they point to other aspects of who the Messiah is going to be. This one talks specifically about the suffering servant. I have heard that the Jews try to say that this is talking about them, but I don't see them as taking on people's sins, iniquities, sicknesses, and I don't see them being given a rich man's tomb. Obviously, during the Holocaust, which was horrible, they were slaughtered for no reason, and some may have been rich, some may have been thieves. Not just the Jews, but the others that were also in the concentration camps that were slaughtered as well, because it wasn't just the Jews were the majority. But yeah, I don't see how this chapter could possibly talk about a nation. A person, definitely. A nation, I think that's a stretch. But let's move on to Jeremiah. Jeremiah 23:56, it's there on the screen. I'm going to read it. The days are coming, this is Yahweh's declaration, when I will raise up a righteous branch of David. He will reign wisely as king and administer justice and righteousness in the land. In his days, Judah will be saved and Israel will dwell securely. This is what he will be named, Yahweh our righteousness. Now, this is one of the passages that's in the middle of one of the passages, if I remember my research correctly, that is not in the shorter version of Jeremiah. However, I think it's still valid as a prophecy, because why would the Jews put something like this in there after Jesus? Excuse me. And so I think that even the longer version of Jeremiah has to be older than the time of Jesus. Again, I'll have to look and see exactly what copies were found of the Dead Sea Scrolls and when they're dated and that kind of thing. I'll probably have to buy a book that is all about the Dead Sea Scroll finds, which is fine with me. I like those kind of books. So, but the interesting thing here, Yahweh our righteousness. It seems here, I mean, a lot of the names, actually all of the names in the Old Testament and the New, have a meaning to them, especially the Old Testament names, though. Today in our society, names, they have meanings, but we don't pay attention to them. They're not that big of a deal. And so, like, Zechariah, I'm not sure what Zechariah means. And I'm sorry, I should have looked up some names with meanings. I just thought about it now. But you can pretty easily look up Bible name meanings, and you will see all the meanings of the names. This one, though, Yahweh our righteousness, seems odd. Um, if it were Yahweh is our righteousness or Yahweh is my righteousness, that seems more along what I'm positive a lot of the names um, go with. It's something of the, so like the um, Jeremiah, Jeremiah, the Yah at the end is short for Yahweh, and like Daniel, the L is God, and so a lot of the names are either Yahweh or God is my something, or something is Yahweh, a form of righteousness or holiness or something along those lines. Um, but this here, and I would like to look at the original Hebrew. Actually, I need to look at that. But everything I looked at is Yahweh our righteousness. There's no is in there. If there were an is in there, then it could be anybody. But this seems to be pointing out that the branch that will come from David is Yahweh himself, is God himself. And that's something that Trinitarians have always taught, is that Jesus is Yahweh. Um, Jesus is God. He's not the Father, but he is Yahweh. Um, and so I think that this passage shows that, and even if it's not in the shorter version, it's still interesting that the Jews would have put it in there, and it's definitely not a Christian thing because it's in the Masoretic text, and the Masoretes were Jews, not Christians. Um, and if indeed the longer version of Jeremiah is in the Dead Sea Scrolls, as I believe it was found there, um, then the Essenes there at the Dead Sea, they weren't Christians either. I don't even know if they knew about Jesus or not, about what had been going on in Jerusalem. They may have, they may not have. It was a monastery type society. They probably didn't get out much. So a few other passages in Jeremiah. He would be born a king. And there's talk about the massacre of infants, which, if I may, I want to read that real quick. So I'm going to flip all the way back here. Jeremiah 31:15. Eventually I'll get to where I can do this all on the computer. Okay. This is what Yahweh says. A voice was heard in Ramah, a lament with bitter weeping. Rachel weeping for her children, refusing to be comforted for her children because they are no more. Now that, I have to look at the bigger context here, but everything that I looked at did point to this being the massacre of the infants in a prophecy. And of course, prophecy is apocalyptic. There's a few different ways to interpret it. Some prophecies are very, very specific, like the 70 weeks of years we talked about last time in Daniel. And I think Isaiah 53 is pretty specific. Psalm 22 is specific. I believe it's Malachi that says the Messiah will be born in Bethlehem. That's very, very, very specific. Also, the Messiah will be born of a virgin, which is found in Isaiah as well. There is a bit of a debate. Is it a virgin or just a young woman? If I remember correctly, the Septuagint version, the Greek Old Testament, when it translates the Isaiah passage at least, and I think the Jeremiah passage as well, it uses the Greek term for virgin, which there's no dispute there as to what that word means. It can't just mean a young lady, it means virgin. So, I'd be happy to look more into that if and when the time comes. And I'm sure I will. I have plans to go much more in depth with smaller chunks of scripture over a longer period of time, since I'm young and I have time in my life to do that, hopefully, God willing. The Messiah would be the new covenant, and if you remember, well, if you read it, I believe it's the one in John, the Last Supper, where he breaks the bread. He says, "This bread represents my body broken for you. Eat this in remembrance of me." And then later on in the meal, he takes up the cup and he says, "This represents my blood, which is the new covenant for you. Drink this in remembrance of me." So there's the new covenant there. And then he would be a descendant of David, which is in Isaiah quite a bit. And it's also up there in Jeremiah 30. So now let's go to Zechariah chapter 11, and I'm going to read this in its entirety. And it's pretty interesting. I'm only going to point out a few things. I'm not going to go back through it entirely like I did Isaiah 53, but I am going to read the whole thing. Open your gates, Lebanon, and fire will consume your cedars. Wail, Cypress, for the cedar has fallen. The glorious trees are destroyed. Wail, oaks of Bashan, for the stately forest has fallen. Listen to the wail of the shepherds, for their glory is destroyed. Listen to the roar of young lions, for the thickets of the Jordan are destroyed. Yahweh my God says this: shepherd the flock intended for slaughter. Those who buy them slaughter them, but are not punished. Those who sell them say, praise Yahweh, because I am, praise Yahweh, because I have become rich. Even their own shepherds have no compassion for them. Indeed, I will no longer have compassion on the inhabitants of the land, Yahweh's declaration. Instead, I will turn everyone over to his neighbor and his king. They will devastate the land, and I will not deliver it from them. So I shepherded the flock intended for slaughter, the afflicted of the flock. I took 2 staffs, calling one favor and the other union, and I shepherded the flock. In 1 month I got rid of 3 shepherds. I became impatient with them, and they also detested me. Then I said, I will no longer shepherd you. Let what is dying die, and let what is going astray go astray. Let the rest devour each other's flesh. Next I took my staff called favor and cut it in 2, annulling the covenant I had made with all the peoples. It was annulled on that day, and so the afflicted of the flock who were watching me knew that it was the word of Yahweh. Then I said to them, if it seems right to you, give me my wages, but if not, keep them. So they weighed my wages, 30 pieces of silver. Throw it to the potter, Yahweh said to me. This magnificent price I was valued by them. So I took the 30 pieces of silver and threw it into the house of Yahweh to the potter. Then I cut it into my staff, my second staff, union, annulling the brotherhood between Judah and Israel. Yahweh also said to me, take the equipment of a foolish shepherd. I am about to raise up a shepherd in the land who will not care for those who are going astray, and who will not seek the lost or heal the broken. He will not sustain the healthy, but he will devour the flesh of the fat sheep and tear off their hooves. Woe to the worthless shepherd who deserts the flock. May a sword strike his arm and his right eye. May his arm wither away, and his right eye go completely blind. Now, that may not seem like much of a prophecy. It may not seem like a messianic prophecy. And especially, since in the time of Zechariah, maybe a little after, it was fulfilled. But a lot of prophecies have dual fulfillments as well. And, when you think about it, the bad shepherd at the beginning, or the bad shepherds, I should say, do seem to represent the religious leaders of Israel around the time of Jesus. And I was going to say that a shepherd, the term shepherd is often used of religious leaders, those who, whether they're Jewish rabbis or in the time of the apostles themselves, or elders, deacons, presbyters, and a few other titles, with all of which pretty much mean the same thing. Deacon means servant, but I think the elder and the presbyter are two different ways of translating the Greek presbyteros, if I remember correctly, which I may not, to be honest. But at any rate, a shepherd is a leader, not just of a flock, but when it's talking about God's people, he's a religious leader. And our pastors today are leaders as well, will be shepherds as well. The interesting thing, starting in verse 12, they gave him 30 pieces of silver. Now in Exodus 21, I forget the verse, I looked it up just before I started this. I think it's 21:14 or something like that. The price of a slave is given as 30 pieces of silver. So this was an insult to Zechariah, that they paid him 30 pieces of silver. At least they paid him, but it was still an insult. And then throw it to the potter. There's a footnote in my Bible that says some of the manuscripts read treasury instead of potter. I'm not entirely certain which way I would go on it, just because I haven't looked into it. But the New Testament quotes at least verse 13 there as potter, because it's talking about this being a fulfilled prophecy when Judas was given 30 pieces of silver for giving up Jesus, and then he buys a potter's field with it and hangs himself, or of course there's another one that says he threw the money into the sanctuary there and then went to a potter's field and hung himself. So I need to look into that. I'm pretty sure he just threw the money in and then hung himself in a potter's field. So that pretty well seems to define what's going on around the time of Jesus. The last thing I want to look at tonight is Yahweh as the Messiah here in Zechariah. I got 12:10 on the thing there. I'm also going to look at 12:1 real quick, just to show you that it is Yahweh talking in 12:10. And if you don't believe me, then start in 12:1 and read on through 12:10 and keep going. It's all Yahweh talking. And by the way, I just want to make note, this picture here is from a movie called The Gathering. It's an interesting movie. It's not really scary or gory or anything. It's a thriller. It's, I think you could watch it with your kids and be okay. I don't remember if there's any kind of language issues in there as far as curse words. But look that up on Internet Movie Database and see exactly what's going on. I use this picture because everyone in that fresco is looking at Christ. And you won't see that picture until towards the end of the movie if you watch it, so I'm not going to spoil it for you. But I just want to say that everyone in that fresco is looking towards the crucified Christ, who is right there. So, Zechariah 12:1. I should say the word of Yahweh, not the world. The word of Yahweh concerning Israel, a declaration of Yahweh, who stretched out the heavens, laid the foundation of the earth, and formed the spirit of man within him. So, this is saying the God that created everything, he's the one saying this. He stretched out the heavens, he laid the foundation of the earth, and he made man's spirit and put it inside him. Now the big one, Zechariah 12:10. And this, I don't know why this is my favorite Trinity verse, but it is. And it's not something that I hear a lot of people talking about for some odd reason. I've tried to look into it. I haven't seen anyone saying don't use this for this reason, but anyway. So, then I will pour out a spirit of grace and prayer on the house of David and the residents of Jerusalem, and they will look upon me whom they pierced. They will mourn for him as one mourns for an only child. Forgive the typos, please. And weep bitterly for him as one weeps for a firstborn. The important things to point out, it says they will look upon me whom they pierced, and we just established that Yahweh is the one speaking here. And again, if you want to read the rest of the verses 2 through 9 to make sure that someone else didn't start speaking, go ahead. I'm fine with you fact checking me. I want you to. I want you to look into it. And then the fact that they switched over from first person to third person. They will look upon me whom they've pierced. They will mourn for him as one mourns for an only child. This is telling me that it is Yahweh speaking. Yahweh comes down, and then it refers to the Son, him. And with, it goes back and forth. I mean, in the Bible, you can look, there's back and forth mentions, not all the time, but there are back and forth mentions where it'll start with the first person, go to the third, or start with the third and go to the first, or back and forth like that. In Genesis, we have it where it says, "Let us make man in our image." That's first person, and then the next verse. And so God, went down and created man, male and female. He created them. And so I think that shows that it is Yahweh who came down and suffered for us, not just another being, not just another angel, or not another angel, not just an angel, like the witnesses believe, and not the spirit brother of us all, like the Mormons believe, but God himself, who came down in the form of the Son. And if you want to know a little bit more about the Trinity, I have started a series of blog posts about the Trinity on my website. Go to brianediger.com and go to the series tab, and then the Trinity series. There's an introduction, and then at the bottom of the introduction page is a button for the first part of the series, and I will add more buttons as more parts come along. So look forward to that. And if you have questions, feel free to contact me. So next, we'll be moving into the New Testament. And really the only thing I have to say right now is that there was 400 years of silence from Malachi, which is the last book of the Bible written, or last book of the Old Testament written. And when John the Baptist started his ministry, there was about 400 years of silence there, where God did not say anything to any prophets, didn't have them write anything down, as far as we know anyway. The Catholics do use the first and second book of Maccabees, possibly the third and fourth. I'm not positive on that part, which that came in maybe 100 or 200 years after Malachi, maybe even a little further. Yeah, so we're going to start on the New Testament. Again, we're probably going to do at least 2, if not 3 sessions on the Gospels, and I may do the Gospel of John separately, just because it is so very different from the other 3 in what it talks about, not in who Jesus is. The first 3 Well, we'll talk more about that later because I want to make sure I think it through and give you the um, proper part of it. Beyond that, I do want to say that I am trying to get this ministry to be a full-time thing. The only way I could do that, of course, is if I can make some money off of it to pay my bills. I don't want to get rich. I don't want to have a big following or a big church. I just want to be able to focus on ministry work and still pay my bills. If you would like to help me out with that, there is a support page on my website with a few options for you to donate, um, either through buying stuff on Amazon. I have an affiliate link there, um, or buying some of the health drinks that I sell, and um, and then there's a PayPal link, so you can just give if you want. Although if you do that, I cannot give you a tax receipt yet. I am working on getting the 501 C3 status to do that, but that's probably going to take a while. I'm also thinking about making a Patreon page, which would be a way for you to give monthly. It's kind of like Kickstarter, but monthly. And I guess let me know if you think it's a good idea or not. And I'll let you know once I make it, if I do or if I've decided not to. And that's all I have for now. So God bless. Have a good evening, and I'll see you in a couple weeks.